For months, the German High Command believed the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse until a captured set of secret maps revealed an army far larger than anyone in Berlin had dared to imagine. Summer 1941, Operation Barbarossa had exploded across the Eastern Front with a violence the world had never seen. Nearly 3 million German soldiers surged into Soviet territory along a front stretching over 1,800 miles. Panzer divisions cut deep into Red Army defenses. Entire Soviet formations were surrounded, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners shuffled westward into captivity. To many German officers, it felt less like a campaign and more like an unstoppable avalanche. Reports arriving at headquarters spoke of shattered resistance and disorganized retreats. The Soviet Union, they believed, was a giant with feet of clay. Among the commanders driving this advance was General Oberst Heinz Guderian, architect of Germany's armored warfare doctrine and one of the sharpest operational minds in the Wehrmacht. His panzer groups had already demonstrated their terrifying effectiveness in Poland and France. Speed, coordination, and relentless pressure defined his approach. But unlike some of his more ideological peers, Guderian paid close attention to logistics, terrain, and the enemy's capacity to regenerate. He understood that wars were not won by early victories alone. Still, even Guderian could not entirely escape the atmosphere of confidence sweeping through the German command structure. Intelligence estimates before Barbarossa had suggested the Red Army possessed roughly 200 divisions. Brutal purges under Stalin had supposedly crippled Soviet leadership. Many German planners predicted the campaign would end in 10 to 12 weeks. Then, something unexpected happened. In late July, after another successful encirclement near Smolensk, German reconnaissance units overran what appeared to be a hastily abandoned Soviet field headquarters. Staff cars were still parked nearby. Communication wires trailed through the mud. Papers lay scattered across tables as if the officers had fled mid-briefing. Inside one of the command tents, German officers discovered several large map cases. At first glance, they seemed routine, operational charts marked with rail lines, rivers, defensive belts. But as intelligence staff began unrolling the documents, the mood shifted. These were not merely regional maps, they were comprehensive mobilization overlays, layered with symbols indicating reserve armies, reinforcement corridors, industrial relocation routes, and planned defensive depths extending hundreds of miles beyond the current front. One officer reportedly muttered that the Soviets were preparing not for defeat, but for endurance. When the maps were rushed up the chain of command, Guderian studied them personally. Colored grease pencil markings revealed formation after formation, positioned far beyond what German intelligence had predicted. Entire armies were shown assembling east of Moscow. Others were forming near the Volga. Rail networks stretched like arteries into the interior, suggesting the Soviets were already moving factories and manpower away from the reach of German bombers. If the maps were accurate, the Wehrmacht had not even encountered the majority of Soviet strength. For a long moment, Guderian said nothing. He traced the distances with his finger, from the current German spearheads to Moscow and then beyond. The sheer geographic scale was sobering. Every mile forward lengthened supply lines that were already strained to the breaking point. Fuel trucks bounced along primitive roads that dissolved into mud after rain. Horses, still responsible for hauling much of Germany's artillery and supplies, collapsed from exhaustion. And yet, according to these maps, the enemy could simply trade space for time. This realization cut against the central assumption of Barbarossa that the Soviet Union would crumble after a series of massive encirclements near the border. Instead, the maps suggested a defense in depth on a continental scale. Guderian later wrote about the danger of underestimating Russia's capacity to absorb punishment. Whether this exact moment planted that certainty is debated by historians, but accounts from staff officers describe a visible change in tone. The easy talk of imminent victory began to fade, replaced by quieter, more cautious conversations. Because the maps implied something even more troubling. The Soviets were learning. Early disasters had forced the Red Army to adapt rapidly. Command structures were reorganizing. Fresh officers, often younger, less politically entangled, were stepping into leadership roles. Factories were dismantled in Ukraine and Western Russia, then transported east of the Ural Mountains where German aircraft could not reach them. Within months, those factories would begin producing tanks, guns, and aircraft in staggering numbers. Germany had planned for a short war. The Soviet Union was preparing for a long one. When summaries of the captured materials reached higher headquarters, reactions were mixed. Some intelligence officers argued the figures must be exaggerated, perhaps deliberate deception. After all, the Red Army had already lost millions of men. How could it possibly field more armies? But others were less certain. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, had already begun revising his own estimates upward. Each week seemed to bring reports of new Soviet formations appearing where no one was expected. Destroyed divisions re-emerged with new equipment. Defensive lines stiffened rather than collapsed. The maps gave shape to a fear that had previously been only a suspicion. Germany might be fighting an opponent whose resources were effectively bottomless. Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler remained outwardly confident. He continued to believe that capturing key cities, Leningrad, Moscow, Kiev, would trigger systemic Soviet collapse. To him, the campaign was still fundamentally a race towards decisive objectives. But field commanders were confronting a different reality. Every advance came at a cost. Tanks wore out faster than factories could replace them. Experienced NCOs were killed or wounded. Ammunition expenditures exceeded projections. And always there was the question of distance. Russia seemed to stretch endlessly eastward. One staff officer recalled that after reviewing the maps, a senior general quietly observed, "We are advancing into immensity." By August, strategic disagreements intensified. Should Army Group Center drive directly towards Moscow, the political and transportation heart of the Soviet Union, or should armored forces pivot south to destroy Soviet armies around Kiev? Guderian favored the thrust towards Moscow, arguing that speed remained Germany's greatest advantage. Delay would grant the Soviets precious time to mobilize the very reserves indicated on those captured maps. Hitler chose otherwise. Panzer units turned south, achieving one of the largest encirclements in military history. Over 600,000 Soviet prisoners were taken near Kiev. It was a tactical masterpiece, but it consumed weeks of critical campaigning weather. When the offensive towards Moscow finally resumed, autumn rains transformed roads into oceans of mud. Vehicles sunk to their axles. Supply columns crawled forward at walking pace. Mechanics worked through freezing nights to keep engines alive. And still, new Soviet armies appeared. Some German officers remembered the maps then, their markings no longer abstract symbols, but living formations now blocking the road to Moscow. By October, temperatures plunged, frost coated rifles, lubricants thickened. Soldiers wrapped rags around their boots in desperate attempts to prevent frostbite. Many had been issued summer uniforms, the campaign originally expected to conclude before winter. Across the front, a subtle but profound psychological shift was underway. The question was no longer how quickly Germany would win, but whether it could win at all. Captured Soviet documents continued to reinforce the same message: reserves, depth, resilience. The Red Army was bending, not breaking. For a general trained to evaluate wars through the lens of logistics and sustainability, the implications were stark. Blitzkrieg relied on rapid collapse. Without it, Germany faced a grinding, attritional struggle against a nation with greater manpower and growing industrial output. Some commanders began to grasp the enormity of that prospect. The Soviet Union was not merely defending territory, it was mobilizing an entire civilization for war. As winter approached Moscow, Siberian divisions, well equipped for cold weather and trained in harsh conditions, arrived to reinforce Soviet lines. Intelligence suggested they had been transferred after confirmation that Japan would not attack from the east. The reserves shown on those early maps were becoming reality. German troops, exhausted.
The winter counteroffensive before Moscow did more than push German divisions backward. It shattered the illusion that the Soviet Union was staggering toward defeat. For commanders who had studied the captured maps months earlier, the meaning was now unmistakable. The Red Army had reserves, it had space, and, most dangerously of all, it had time. As January 1942 tightened its frozen grip across the Eastern Front, German units struggled simply to survive. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius, rifle bolts froze shut, engines refused to turn over, horses died where they stood, their bodies stiffening into the snow. Soldiers hacked at the ground with bayonets just to carve shallow fighting positions in earth hardened like iron. The Wehrmacht had not been equipped for this kind of war. General Heinz Guderian watched the situation deteriorate with growing alarm. He had long warned that extended supply lines and harsh weather could cripple mechanized operations, but now the consequences were undeniable. Fuel shortages immobilized panzer formations that had once embodied speed and shock. Spare parts were scarce. Even when tanks survived combat, mechanical failure often claimed them soon after. Yet, across the front, Soviet pressure only increased. Fresh divisions appeared again and again, many composed of troops from Siberia and the Far East, disciplined soldiers accustomed to brutal winters. Clad in white camouflage, they seemed almost invisible against the frozen landscape. German sentries sometimes did not see them until artillery shells were already falling. The reserves shown on those secret maps were no longer theoretical markings, they were attacking in force. Inside German headquarters, arguments intensified. Some generals urged elastic defense, withdraw to shorter lines, preserve manpower, avoid encirclement. But Hitler refused. Retreat, in his view, was psychological weakness. He issued his infamous stand fast orders, commanding units to hold ground regardless of cost. For officers trained in operational flexibility, the directive was deeply troubling. Guderian was among those who protested. He argued that controlled withdrawals could prevent catastrophe. Mobile warfare required maneuver. Freezing divisions in place turned them into targets. But Hitler's distrust of his generals had hardened, and disagreement was increasingly interpreted as disloyalty. In December 1941, after repeated clashes over strategy, Guderian was relieved of his command. His removal sent a quiet signal through the officer corps. Professional judgment was yielding to ideological stubbornness. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was transforming itself at a pace few in Germany had thought possible. Entire industrial complexes, thousands of machines, millions of workers had been dismantled and transported eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. By early 1942, those factories were producing weapons in staggering quantities. The T-34 tank, rugged and well-suited for harsh terrain, rolled off assembly lines faster than German intelligence could track. Artillery batteries multiplied, aircraft production surged. Germany, by contrast, was still operating on a partially peacetime economic footing. Hitler had avoided full industrial mobilization early in the war, fearing it would lower civilian morale. That hesitation now carried enormous consequences. The conflict was becoming a test not just of armies, but of production, and on that battlefield, the Soviet Union held advantages that grew with every passing month. During the spring thaw of 1942, both sides regrouped. Mud returned, swallowing vehicles and slowing movement to a crawl. Yet, as conditions improved, German planners sought to regain the initiative with a new offensive aimed toward the south. The objective was ambitious: seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut the Soviet Union off from critical fuel supplies. Without oil, mechanized warfare would grind to a halt. The campaign promised decisive results, if it succeeded, but it required stretching German forces across vast distances once again. Some officers could not help recalling the lesson implied by those secret maps. Depth favored the defender. Russia did not end where German planners hoped it would. Still, in the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht advanced. Initial progress was impressive. Soviet units fell back. Cities were threatened. Confidence flickered again within parts of the German command. Then attention shifted to a city on the Volga whose name carried political weight: Stalingrad. What began as a supporting objective gradually transformed into an obsession. Street by street, factory by factory, the battle consumed men at a horrifying rate. Rubble turned every block into a fortress. Snipers haunted shattered buildings. Control of a single staircase might change hands multiple times in a day. German firepower inflicted enormous damage, but the Soviets refused to yield. Reinforcements crossed the Volga under constant bombardment. Civilians joined the defense. The struggle became less about maneuver and more about endurance. And endurance was precisely what the Soviet system had prepared for. By November 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive encirclement targeting the weaker Axis forces guarding the German flanks. Romanian and Hungarian units, stretched thin and poorly equipped for anti-tank defense, collapsed under the assault. Within days, the Sixth Army was trapped inside Stalingrad. Nearly 300,000 soldiers found themselves surrounded. For many senior officers, the catastrophe felt eerily familiar, not because they had predicted Stalingrad specifically, but because the underlying danger had been visible from the beginning. The Soviet Union possessed the manpower and strategic depth to absorb blows and strike back where Germany was vulnerable. The maps had shown that potential. Now the world was witnessing it. Hitler forbade breakout attempts, insisting the army hold its position until relief arrived. Supplies were to be delivered by air, a logistical fantasy that quickly unraveled. Transport aircraft could provide only a fraction of what was needed. Hunger spread, ammunition dwindled, frostbite and disease followed. By February 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. The shock rippled across Europe. Germany had lost not just an army, but the aura of inevitability that had once accompanied its campaigns. After Stalingrad, the strategic initiative began slipping permanently from German hands. The following year brought the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank engagement in history. German planners hoped that a concentrated blow might stabilize the front. Instead, they collided with deeply layered Soviet defenses, minefields, anti-tank guns, reserve armor positioned precisely where breakthroughs were expected. Again, the pattern repeated: preparation, depth, resilience. Germany could still fight with extraordinary skill, but it was now reacting rather than dictating events. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued to outproduce the Reich. Allied Lend-Lease shipments added trucks, locomotives, food, and raw materials, enhancing Soviet mobility and logistics. What had once been a desperate defensive war was evolving into a relentless westward push. By 1944, the Red Army launched Operation Barbarossa, annihilating Army Group Center and destroying dozens of German divisions. Entire formations vanished from the order of battle. The scale of the disaster dwarfed even Stalingrad in territorial consequences. To observers who traced the arc backward, the logic was unmistakable. Germany had gambled on a short war against an opponent capable of fighting a long one. Years earlier, when those secret Soviet maps were first unrolled across a field table, they hinted at exactly this outcome. Symbols marked reserve armies not yet engaged, industrial routes beyond bomber range, fallback lines stretching into the continent's vast interior. They revealed a nation prepared to retreat, rebuild, and return stronger. War often turns on moments that seem quiet at the time. Documents captured, estimates revised, assumptions questioned. Yet leaders do not always act on the warnings placed before them. In the case of the Eastern Front, the signs were present from the very beginning. The Wehrmacht had invaded with breathtaking speed, but it had underestimated geography, production, and the mobilizing power of a society fighting for survival. Blitzkrieg could shatter armies near the border, it could not erase the distances beyond. For at least one perceptive general studying those maps in 1941, the realization came early. Germany was entering a struggle not measured in weeks, but in years, and against such depth, even brilliance in battle might not be enough. History would prove that fear justified. By May 1945, Soviet forces stood in Berlin. The war that many had expected to end in a single campaigning season concluded instead amid the ruins of the Third Reich. And looking back, it's hard